in some sense, is we're seeing hundreds of thousands of young people from Russia escape the country to avoid the conscription, the so-called partial mobilization that Putin. So this partial mobilization order may be turning a lot of Russians against the war who were not against it before, but just sitting on the sideline.
If you're analysing Zelensky and looking at how influential he's been in this war, and keeping Ukraine in this fight, perhaps for a lot longer than people might have expected at the beginning, would you say that this was a good and honourable decision of Times Magazine to name him in this way?
Yes, and it follows in the transformation of Winston Churchill into a great leader through his wartime leadership. It's very similar in some respects. And of course, both the Financial Times and Time Magazine have named Zelensky. And that's something that I think audiences around the world, certainly in Europe and the United States, would understand.
Do you think this kind of thing sort of affects, him? Do you think it's a boost? Do you think it affects morale, these sorts being named a person of the year in this way?
Yes, it will affect morale. Morale is already high in Ukraine. As you know from numerous media interviews with ordinary people, they want to defend their country, defend their freedoms, defend their democracy. And so Zelensky has become a symbol of that.
Mm. And he's been visiting troops in the Donbass, which of course has been the main focus of the fighting after Ukrainian troops pushed Russian forces out of the southern city of Kherson last month. Looking on, how would you characterize the fighting there at the moment? And would you say that sort of the winter weather and the extreme conditions there has slowed activity in any way?
So first, Zelensky's visiting troops on the front line contrasts against Putin's not visiting troops on the front line. Putin stays in a relatively reclusive, safe position. I think that has a morale impact on troops in Ukraine, Ukrainian troops as well as Russian troops in a different way. The winter weather is having an impact, but if it freezes pretty soon, the Ukrainians will be prepared to continue the fight with mechanized warfare. With mechanized warfare, with armored personnel carriers and tanks, you need to have hard ground. And so freezing would allow that to happen. The Ukrainians do not want to let Russians have a moment of rest, if you will, for a couple of months because the battlefield momentum currently is on the Ukrainian side. They want to continue that both for military reasons and morale reasons.
You talk about mechanized warfare, but there are reports that Ukraine's Western allies are running low on the military material that's been incredibly important in sort of keeping Ukrainian forces going. What can you tell us about that, and how serious of an issue it is at the moment? This idea that Western allies are running low. What impact do you think that will have?
It is a serious issue, but the main impact is on the question of starting up production lines in the military-industrial complex, if you will. There is no sign that the United States, especially, is running so low that the number of munitions sent to Ukraine is going to suffer as a result of that. The United States still has quite a lot.
I mean, the sort of question that we feel like we've been asking since the war started is, what will actually happen? What we need is, I suppose, a diplomatic effort. Where are we in terms of seeing any international diplomatic effort or any progress at all towards some sort of talks between the two sides? I mean, or is that out of the question? And if it's out of the question, what are we looking at when we look to the future of this war?
Well, diplomacy usually plays a role in resolving conflicts when both sides have reached a point of exhaustion of some sort. That has not yet occurred. Russia continues fighting, and the Ukrainians have battlefield momentum, so they're not going to stop fighting either. In the end, diplomacy may play some role, but it's quite possible that this war is going to end in victory for Ukraine and defeat for Russia. Can't predict, but that's a possibility. And so in that case, diplomacy would only be cleaning up odds and ends. And that's what happened after World War II, for example. It ended in victory, and diplomacy only cleaned up a few odds and ends. So we should not say that diplomacy is needed now, or we should not say that all wars end in diplomacy, because that is not the case.
No, and I mean, just looking a bit further into what you just said, what makes you think that it would be end with victorious Ukraine when you're looking at where we are now? What leads you to believe that that might be the outcome?
There is no sign yet that Russia has the potential to regain momentum, to retake, for example, places like Kherson City, which it just lost. Thus far, the Ukrainians have morale, they have equipment, they have the best equipment from the West. It looks like Ukrainians are going to continue with battlefield successes. We cannot predict for sure what will happen, but thus far, we don't see signs of Ukrainian forces being exhausted, and we don't see signs of Russians who have sacrificed some of their best military talent already being able to rebuild that quickly enough to affect the outcome of the battle.
Are the sanctions, I mean, these are sort of the things we've been looking at and wondering for so many months, but are the sanctions, international sanctions, having any impact on Russia and its ability to continue to wage this war? I mean, you mentioned that neither side was exhausted, but, perhaps the Russians are more inclining to that, given the sort of support, or are they completely getting around the sanctions that are depriving them of resources?
Occasionally, the Russians may be able to steal computer chips and things like that, but for the scale needed to maintain their economy, the sanctions are biting heavily. So, for example, the auto sector has been most affected in Russia. I think production is down there by over half. And the venerable Lada car that is produced by one of the auto companies is now being produced without any of its safety electronics, for example. So we're going to see the sanctions bite deeper and deeper as time goes on.
Just lastly, Vladimir Putin, he said that the threat of a nuclear war was rising. There's been a lot of talk about nuclear war sort of from Russia, from the Kremlin. But, he's insisted in his words, Russia had not gone mad and would not use its nuclear weapons first. As ever, it's incredibly hard to sort of work out what he's actually talking about. What do you think when he continues to use rhetoric about the threat of nuclear war? Is it something that should be taken seriously? Is it something that should cause alarm to the rest of the world?
It should always be taken seriously. It should not cause alarm. Putin earlier talked about nuclear threats, but then after he met with Chinese leader Xi Jinping in Samarkand, Uzbekistan, and also with the Indian leader Narendra Modi, both of them publicly criticized Russia's war in Ukraine. And Xi Jinping appears also to have been critical of nuclear threats from Russia. So since then, we have seen Russia stop talking about nuclear threats. And since then, they've been making comments, as Putin did today, that, we're not mad. We're not going to do something crazy. So I think the nuclear threat idea, which maybe never was that serious, has subsided even further as a potential tool that Russians will use.
And these are really interesting lines coming from Putin today, aren't they? Sort of, as you've just mentioned, as we said, that insisting Russia had not gone mad, and then sort of insisting or maintaining himself that the war in Ukraine could be a lengthy process. So he himself doesn't really know or see where the end to this comes. If he's describing it as a lengthy process, he obviously doesn't feel optimistic that it's going to be a quick victory for him either.
He may think that Russia could win a long, drawn-out battle of attrition warfare, if you will. But the Ukrainians have more military momentum and may not allow Russia to drag out the fight as long as Putin may be hoping. Putin may think that Europeans will tire of backing Ukrainian forces, or even that Republicans in the U.S. Might restrict some Ukrainian aid, but those do not seem to be developing. Momentum in the West to continue supporting Ukraine is strong. Ukrainian morale is strong. They're succeeding on the battlefield. The sanctions are going to bite deeper, and the West has control of $300 billion or so of Russian central bank reserves in Western banks. So the indicators of power and influence are pretty much all on the Ukrainian and Western side.
Just lastly, one of the things that journalists continually try to ascertain is the Russian morale, not on the front line, but sort of in the homes of the Russian people.
Reliable in some sense is we're seeing hundreds of thousands of young people from Russia escape the country to avoid the conscription, the so-called partial mobilization that Putin. So this partial mobilization order may be turning a lot of Russians against the war who were not against it before, but just sitting on the sideline.